On a warm July morning in 1911, a locomotive carrying over 100 passengers pulled into a tunnel carved through the Italian mountains. People stood on the platform at the other end, waiting for it to emerge. They heard the whistle, they heard the wheels grinding against the rails. And then they heard nothing. The train never came out. No wreckage, no fire, no bodies. 106 people, a crew of 3 passenger carriages, a coal tender, and a 40-ton locomotive simply stopped, existing somewhere between the entrance and the exit of a tunnel, barely 1 kilometer long. And to this day, no one has been able to explain what happened inside. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore passed down by superstitious villagers around a fire. This is a documented event that the Italian railway authorities spent years trying to bury, and that investigators across 3 countries tried and failed to resolve. What you are about to hear is a minute-by-minute reconstruction of what we know, built from railway records, witness depositions, and one deeply unsettling detail that nobody talks about. Let me take you back. In the summer of 1911, Italy was a country in a hurry. The economy was booming. Factories in the north were pulling workers from the south by the tens of thousands. Milan, Turin, Genoa, these cities were growing so fast that new railway lines were being laid almost every month. Train travel was not a luxury anymore. It was the bloodstream of the country. Farmers, merchants, engineers, families, everyone rode the rails. The Italian railway network had become the most ambitious infrastructure project in southern Europe, with hundreds of new tunnels blasted through the Apennine Mountains to connect the peninsula from coast to coast. And that is important, because the tunnels were new. Many of them had been completed only a year or 2 before this story begins. The rock was freshly cut, the ventilation was minimal, and the inspection protocols were, by modern standards, practically non-existent. A tunnel would be surveyed once after construction, stamped as safe, and then trains would barrel through it day after day without anyone checking whether the walls were holding, whether water was seeping in, whether the geology had shifted. That was the world this train entered, a world of new infrastructure and old oversight. The train in question was a regional service running from Rome northward. The exact route has been disputed over the years, with some sources pointing toward Lombardy, others toward a junction near the Ligurian coast. What is not disputed is the passenger manifest. 106 ticketed passengers, most of them middle-class Italians heading to the industrial cities for work or family. Among them were reportedly a group of textile merchants from Naples, a retired military officer traveling with his wife, several university students, and a woman with 2 children under the age of 10. Ordinary people, going about ordinary business. None of them had any reason to think this trip would be different from any other. The locomotive was a standard-issue steam engine of the period, coal-fired, capable of pulling 3 to 4 carriages at moderate speed through mountain terrain. The crew consisted of an engineer, a fireman, a brakeman, and a conductor. All 4 were experienced railwaymen. The engineer alone had logged over 12 years on mountain routes. This was not a crew prone to mistakes. Now, imagine you are one of those passengers. You boarded in Rome early that morning. The station was loud, chaotic, full of smoke and shouting porters. You found your seat in the second carriage, a wooden bench with a thin cushion. The windows were open because it was July and there was no air conditioning, just the breeze. Around you, people settled in. Someone opened a newspaper. A child kicked the seat in front of him. The conductor walked through, punching tickets, not making eye contact. The first few hours of the journey were uneventful. The train climbed slowly out of the Roman plains and into the foothills. The landscape changed from flat farmland to rolling green hills, then to rocky slopes dotted with scrub brush and the occasional village clinging to a hillside. You could feel the engine working harder. The rhythm of the wheels changed, slowed, became more deliberate. Every few minutes, the train would enter a short tunnel, maybe 200 meters, and the carriage would go dark for a few seconds before bursting back into sunlight. This happened again and again. It was routine. Darkness, then light, darkness, then light. If you are watching this right now and finding this interesting, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. I know everyone says it, but it genuinely helps this channel keep making content like this. And drop a comment. Tell me if you have ever heard of this story before. I am curious how many of you are coming in fresh. All right, back to the train. By late morning, the train had reached the higher elevations. The air was cooler, the tunnels were getting longer, and the next one on the route was the one that would change everything. Witnesses on the platform of a small mountain station, the last stop before the tunnel, later described the train arriving on schedule. Nothing unusual. The conductor leaned out and signaled. A few passengers got off, a few got on. The station master waved his flag, and the train pulled away, picking up speed as it approached the tunnel entrance. The entrance sat about 800 meters up the track, carved into a sheer wall of grey limestone. This is where the reconstruction gets difficult, because from this point forward, we only have external accounts. Nobody who was on that train ever told their side of the story. Here is what the station master reported. He watched the train enter the tunnel. He heard the whistle echo off the rock walls, the way it always did. He noted the time. And then he turned to go back inside. He did not see the train emerge on the other side because his station was on the entry side. But the station on the far end of the tunnel, roughly 900 meters away through the mountain, had a clear view of the exit. And the signalman stationed there was watching. He said he heard the train coming. The sound carried through the tunnel the way it always did, a low rumble building to a roar. He could feel the vibration in the ground beneath his feet. He stepped onto the platform, ready to log the passage. And then the sound stopped, not faded, stopped as if someone had pressed a button. One moment there was a locomotive barreling through a stone corridor, and the next moment there was silence. He waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. He rang the signal bell to the station on the other side. "Did you send the train?" "Yes," they said. "We sent the train. It entered the tunnel 12 minutes ago." 12 minutes. For a tunnel that should have taken a train moving at that speed roughly 90 seconds to clear. That is the moment this stops being a railway delay and becomes something else entirely. The signalman entered the tunnel on foot. He carried a lantern. The tunnel was straight. No curves, no branches, no side passages. You could see from one end to the other on a clear day, though the middle section dipped slightly where the mountain was thickest. He walked the entire length. 900 meters of stone, rail, and darkness. He found the tracks intact. He found no debris. He found no scorch marks, no sign of derailment, no pooling water, no collapsed section. The tunnel was empty, completely impossibly empty. Within the hour, a second team entered from the other side. Same result. The rails were unbroken. The sleepers were in place. There was no physical evidence that anything had gone wrong. 40-ton locomotive, 3 carriages, a coal tender, and 110 human beings had entered a straight tunnel and had not come out the other side, and the tunnel itself showed no sign of having been disturbed. Now, before we go further, I want to make one thing clear. The Italian Railway Authority did not publicize this. There was no newspaper headline the next day, no public inquiry. What happened instead was a quiet internal investigation that unfolded over the following weeks, conducted by railway engineers, local police, and eventually a small team from Rome that reported directly to the Transport Ministry. The documentation that survives comes from fragments of this investigation, pieces that leaked out over the decades through retired officials, local historians, and one controversial Italian researcher who published a summary in the 1970s. Let me walk you through what the investigation found, or rather, what it did not find. First, they brought in mining engineers to examine the tunnel structure. Every meter of wall was inspected. They were looking for a concealed cavity, a hidden chamber, a collapsed section that might have been sealed by falling rock. They found nothing. The geology was solid limestone, the same formation that runs through that entire section of the Apennines. No fissures, no voids, no weak points. The tunnel was, by every measurable standard, sound. Second, they examined the tracks. Derailed train leaves marks, gouges in the rails, splintered sleepers, metal shavings, oil stains. The tracks inside the tunnel showed normal wear consistent with daily traffic. There was no indication of a sudden stop, a derailment, or any mechanical failure. The train had been moving through the tunnel and had simply ceased to be there. Third, and this is the detail that unsettles me the most, they checked the ventilation. In 1911, mountain tunnels relied on natural airflow. Air entered from one end and exited the other, driven by pressure differentials and the piston effect of passing trains. When the engineers tested the airflow inside the tunnel the day after the disappearance, they found it was normal, undisturbed. If a 40-ton obstacle had been sitting somewhere inside that tunnel, the airflow pattern would have changed. It had not. Whatever had been in that tunnel was no longer there in any physical sense. The investigation went on for weeks, then months. Families of the missing passengers began writing letters. Where is my husband? Where is my son? Where is the woman with 2 children who boarded in Rome? The railway authority responded with silence, then with carefully worded letters suggesting a catastrophic mechanical event that was still under review. No bodies were ever returned, no personal effects were ever recovered. No compensation was ever formally paid, though some sources suggest quiet settlements were made to a handful of families years later. Eventually, the tunnel was closed, not permanently but for several months, ostensibly for structural reinforcement. When it reopened, the railway authority had installed additional signal equipment and, curiously, a secondary lighting system inside the tunnel, something that was almost unheard of for tunnels of that era. No explanation was given for why these improvements were deemed necessary. Now, let us talk about the theories, because there is no shortage of them. The first and most straightforward explanation is a cover-up of an engineering disaster. The tunnel collapsed, killed everyone, and the railway authority secretly cleared the rubble and rebuilt the section to avoid liability. This theory has some logic to it. Railway companies in the early 20th century had enormous incentive to hide accidents. A publicized tunnel collapse would have devastated public confidence in the entire network at a time when the government was investing heavily in expansion. The problem is the timeline. The signalman entered the tunnel less than 30 minutes after the train vanished. Collapse large enough to swallow an entire train would have left massive evidence, dust clouds pouring from the entrance, a visible change in the tunnel profile, debris on the tracks. None of that was present. And clearing a full train's worth of wreckage from a mountain tunnel in 1911 would have taken weeks of heavy labor, not the few hours that passed before the first inspection team arrived. The math simply does not work. The second theory is mechanical failure combined with fire. A boiler explosion could theoretically destroy a locomotive and its carriages, especially in a confined space where the blast would be amplified. And a coal fire could incinerate much of the evidence. But a fire inside a tunnel produces massive amounts of smoke, and the stations on both sides of the tunnel reported no smoke at any point. Moreover, A boiler explosion would have damaged the tunnel walls and tracks. Neither showed any sign of heat or blast damage. The third theory, and this is where the story takes a turn into territory that makes rational people uncomfortable, involves a phenomenon that was being discussed in certain European scientific circles at the time. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was serious academic interest in what was loosely called spatial displacement, the theoretical possibility that certain electromagnetic or geological conditions could create localized distortions in physical space. This was not fringe science at the time. Respected physicists were grappling with the implications of new discoveries in electromagnetism and relativity. The idea that a specific combination of geological composition, magnetic field intensity, and atmospheric pressure could create a zone where physical objects behaved unpredictably was considered speculative but not absurd. And here is where it gets strange. In 1940, nearly 30 years after the Italian disappearance, a small newspaper in Mexico published a story about a group of travelers who arrived disoriented and confused at a rural train station outside Mexico City. According to the report, they spoke Italian, wore clothing that was decades out of fashion, and carried documents dated 1911. They claimed they had just boarded a train in Italy and had no idea how they ended up in Mexico. The story was dismissed as fiction at the time. The newspaper was not considered reputable, and no follow-up investigation was ever published. But the detail about the date, 1911, and the Italian origin has kept this footnote alive in the mythology of the vanishing train for over 80 years. I want to be honest with you here. I cannot verify the Mexico story. No serious historian has been able to trace it back to a primary source. It may well be an invention, a piece of fiction that attached itself to the Italian disappearance the way barnacles attach to a ship. But I include it because it is part of the story as it exists today, and because dismissing it outright would mean ignoring the question it raises. If those people were not the missing passengers, who were they? And if the story is entirely fabricated, why did the fabricator choose 1911? Why Italian passengers? Why the specific details that align so closely with an event that was never widely publicized? This is one of those moments where the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. We cannot prove the Mexico connection, but we also cannot explain its precision. Let me bring us back to the tunnel. In the decades after the disappearance, the tunnel continued to operate. Trains passed through it daily. No further incidents were reported. The mountain did not claim another locomotive. Whatever happened in 1911, it did not repeat. And that, paradoxically, makes the mystery harder to solve, not easier. A recurring phenomenon can be studied, measured, predicted. A singular event leaves you with nothing but the hole it created. The Italian government has never issued a formal statement about the disappearance. The tunnel still exists. It has been modernized, widened, electrified. If you rode through it today on a high-speed train, you would pass through in a matter of seconds and never know that over a century ago, 110 people entered this same corridor of stone and rock and never reached the other side. And that brings me to the thing that keeps this story in my head. It is not the mystery itself. Mysteries are everywhere. It is the passengers. 106 people whose names we barely know, whose faces were never photographed, whose families were told nothing. They woke up that morning in Rome with plans. The textile merchants had orders to fill. The retired officer was probably looking forward to a quiet dinner with his wife. The woman with 2 children was carrying them towards something, a new home, a family visit, a fresh start. All of those futures collapsed into a tunnel entrance on a summer morning and never came out. If this story were fiction, it would be unsatisfying. No resolution, no reveal, no detective standing over the evidence with a knowing look. But that is exactly what makes it real, or at least what makes it feel real. The world does not always explain itself. Sometimes the train does not come out the other side, and sometimes the only honest thing you can say is that you do not know why.